Good day, class. This lecture is entitled Babel and Pentecost, Translatability and Untranslatability by Dr. Sebastian Mahfoud. The controlling image for the presentation, you may notice, is the Tower of Babel. According to the story, which I'll read to you in a moment, the hubris, or overweening pride, that led us to build the tower is what resulted in the scattering of our language and in the confusion of our meaning. But the image is also one of linguistic cohesion, since to build it in the first place required a mutual comprehensibility among the builders. After the one language became many, the problem of human social communion became one of translation and interpretation. The fact that we could still become mutually comprehensible was good, because it was a sign of humility for us to desire to know another person or culture in such a way that we'd spend time learning how to communicate with those who spoke a language and therefore had a culture different from our own. Conversely, it's a sign of self-limiting pride for us to not seek to understand the other in this way. Emily Apter speaks to this point in her book, The Translation Zone, when she writes, "If translation failure is acceded to readily, it becomes an all-purpose expedient for staying narrowly within one's own monolingual universe. A parochialism results, sanctioned by false pieties about not wanting to mistranslate the other. This parochialism is the flip side of a globalism that theorizes place and translates everything without ever traveling anywhere. We can learn other languages, of course, but we cannot learn every other language. A solution is to rely on translations, but it is not just translation that's needed. It's interpretation of the translated text in relation to the culture out of which it came that's needed. An example: a person in Tunisia, North Africa may say, "Nimshi fil Masr," which means, "I'm going to Egypt." Any Tunisian knows what that means. But if an Egyptian hears the same statement, he's going to translate the verb from going to walking and say, "How? One cannot walk from Tunisia to Egypt. It's too far. There's Libya in the way," etc. Technically, the language is the same, but the meaning is culturally different, akin to a person living in the southern United States saying, "I'm fixing dinner." Any Yankee might ask, "How was it broken?" Okay, for the story itself. The text is translated as follows in the New International Version of the Old Testament. Genesis 11:1-9, the Tower of Babel. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone, and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Quite a story on linguistic dispersion, and one that can be best understood in light of another story, namely that of Pentecost, where the apostles were all gathered in the upper room and the Holy Spirit descended upon them, giving them many powers, but importantly, the power of universal communication. After receiving that power, the apostles are able to go into the streets and speak to whole groups, each understanding what is being said in his or her own language, in a way in which the words were understood, not only for what they signified as words, but culturally too, so that had there been a Tunisian and Egyptian in the audience, for instance, neither would have been flowed by the use of a word like nimshi, common to both, but in different ways. The story reads as follows per the New International Version of the New Testament. Acts 2, 1-12. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came down from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they ask one another, 'What does this mean?'" Indeed, what does this mean? The answer to that is found in the 27 books of the New Testament, which begins with the Gospels and Acts, continues with the 13 Pauline and Deutero-Pauline, that is, written in the manner of Paul, epistles, and Hebrews, which some scholars attribute to Paul, or at least his manner, and concludes with the letters from the 3 apostles present with Christ during his transfiguration, a letter by Jude, and the apocalyptic vision of John. It is also found in all the commentary on these scriptures, and on the oral tradition that we find in the Church Fathers, and in the many councils that followed to clarify specific dogmatic points. That's one tradition. Another is the Islamic tradition, where the question of meaning is answered differently. Man was lost in an age of ignorance, so God spoke through the archangel Gabriel to Muhammad, who was chosen to serve as the human mouthpiece of God in continuation of the prophetic tradition. Like Paul, Muhammad was taken up into heaven, where language is universally comprehensible, and returned to the earth for the purpose of spreading the news. And he was able to do so simply by relaying the information revealed to him by God through Gabriel. Because his message was different from the Orthodox version, conflict resulted between those who believe in the Scriptures as received in advance by the Apostles, and those who believe in Scriptures as received in advance by Muhammad. Dante believed, with the church of his day, that Muhammad's message was a schismatic one, and placed him with Ali in the 8th circle of hell, among those who severed the faithful from the true faith. So there are consequences for interpreting things differently. For Muslims, further, the Quran is not simply the truth that God has divinely revealed. In transmitting his word to Muhammad through the mouthpiece of Gabriel, the Quran is the revelation of God himself. This is important to understand in an iconoclastic culture that was wary of all things that could be misunderstood as idols. Muhammad, after all, destroyed 300 of them in the Kaaba, after he was able to establish his faith fully within the city of Mecca. So the words of the Quran loom big everywhere. What can be in a word? A lot. And in the Quran, the direct speech of God is God incarnate, the material manifestation of God on earth, akin less, really, to the Christian Bible and the Hebrew Scriptures that form the Christian Old Testament. The words, like this one here, which reads Allah, are identical in meaning to the Catholic Eucharist, where God's presence takes a material form. God is really present in the Eucharist through the process of transubstantiation, in the same way that God is really present in the written form of the Quran, according to each religion's proponents. So, Are we still living in the aftermath of Babel? Yes, in a real way, as the problem of interpretation presented within these faiths themselves demonstrates. The fact that one way to resolve the differences in interpretation is simply to abrogate what was revealed before is a sign that new social structures require starting over points, the death of the old culture so that the new culture may rise. Here, Islamic salvation history proclaims that what had previously been revealed has just been upgraded. Note, the English translation isn't God incarnate, only the Arabic original. That's a problem for non-Arabic Muslim readers who cannot engage the Quran in its original language. So how does this provide guidance for our understanding of the importance of the translated word? Let's apply it in our own translation exercise, which you may find on the next lesson board.